So welcome everybody to our panel discussion on the intersection of substance abuse, harm reduction strategies, and human trafficking. I would first like to give Dr. Jason Williams a couple seconds to introduce himself and what made this panel actually a reality.
Thank you so much, Doc. And thanks to the panelists and everyone who's here with us tonight. I am Dr. Jason Williams, the co-chair of the Harm Reduction Initiative here in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. I am co-chair with Dr. Svetlana Spiegel. And grants from both Open Society Foundations and Vital Strategies support this initiative. And the initiative is mainly predicated on two main objectives. So first, to provide educational programming such as the event here tonight to the campus and broader community, particularly around drug policy, criminalization, harm reduction strategies, and the lived experiences of those who use substances. And then second, building partnerships with community-based organizations and organizers and those with lived experiences to strategize new avenues of advocacy and empowerment, not only particularly for those with lived experiences, but those communities who are most affected by substance use disorder and harmful drug policy. So I just wanted to give that little welcoming to, again, the panel and everyone who's here with us tonight. And please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jason. Okay, just a little housekeeping before we start. We will have the panel talk for about an hour. Participants have the opportunity to put questions in the Q&A box, which we'll get to around 6 o'clock so that there's enough time to answer any of those questions you may have. We will also record the event, just so you are all aware of that. Let me actually start this right now, and then we can officially get started. So welcome again to the panel discussion on the intersection of substance abuse, harm reduction strategies, and human trafficking. My name is Daniela Peterga-Benton. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Justice Studies at Montclair State University, and I'm also the academic director of Montclair's Global Center on Human Trafficking. Just as a quick introduction, substance use disorders is very common among victims of human trafficking. Existing SUDs may be used to force individuals into trafficking, or they may experience facilitated drug use to keep them compliant. Substance abuse is also not an uncommon way for survivors to cope with the trauma resulting from the trafficking experience. Unfortunately, survivors of trafficking with SUDs experience many additional barriers, such as fear involving law enforcement, for example, or the stigma related to SUDs within the healthcare settings, among many others. So we must gain a better understanding of the intersection of SUDs and trafficking to implement survivor-centered, trauma-informed practices, which help to identify survivors and to provide the specific services they need. We have an impressive number of experts here with us today, who I will now introduce to you. Dr. Abigail Judge is a clinical and forensic psychologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Dr. Judge founded and co-directs Boston Human Exploitation and Trafficking, HEAT, the only clinical and peer-led outreach program for women at the intersection of substance use disorder and commercial sexual exploitation in Massachusetts. This work has been honored with a special citation from the Commission of the Boston Police Department in 2023 and the FBI Director's Community Leadership Award in 2024. Welcome, Dr. Judge. Liz Kimball is the virtual director at the Restoring Ivy Collective and has gained a decade of experience in empowering survivors within the anti-human trafficking field. She specializes in direct programming, offering virtual support groups, restorative chair yoga, art-based emotional wellness, smart recovery, and life coaching. Liz's background spans legislative advocacy, training, media interviews, public speaking, case management, and mentoring, all centered around supporting survivors on their journey to healing and empowerment. Welcome, Liz. Gina Cavallo is a leader and speaker in the anti-trafficking movement and passionate advocate for victims and survivors of human trafficking. Gina is also the founder of Paying It Forward Foundation, aka We Rise USA. She's a survivor consultant and board vice president for the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking and is the co-chair of the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics Anti-Trafficking Task Force. Gina also serves on the New Jersey Commission on Human Trafficking. She has testified on critical policy issues in Washington, D.C. and Trenton, and received the National Liberator Award for Survivor Leadership in 2020. Her first book, A Survivor's Secrets, will be published in May. Welcome, Gina. Ashley Maha'a is a subject matter expert and consultant specializing in the areas of sex trafficking, domestic violence, substance abuse and recovery, and the intersections between them. She has overcome years of barriers from exiting exploitation to graduating magna cum laude in 2020 with a degree in criminal justice, and serves as an expert on task forces and advisory boards in Hawaii and nationwide, including the Missing and Murdered Native Hawaiian Women, Girls, and Mahu movement in Hawaii. She heads her own business, My Truth Is Now, that focuses on storytelling and shifting the narratives and perspectives on substance use and survivorship. A very warm welcome to you, Ashley. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Amanda Stiliano is a nationally recognized expert in the anti-violence field. With over a decade of nonprofit leadership, she became the CEO of Heal Trafficking in 2023. In addition to her leadership positions, Dr. Stiliano is a licensed clinical social worker in New Jersey and Connecticut, and has over 15 years of experience providing clinical and case management services to children and adults with traumatic experiences, mental health disorders, and substance use. She's trained in numerous evidence-based trauma-informed harm reduction approaches to supporting survivors in increasing their safety and well-being. So again, a warm welcome to all of you. And I would like to start right away with a first very simple question, and that is, can you speak to the intersection of harm reduction strategies and human trafficking from your experience? And I would like to take it to Amanda first.
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon or good evening now to everyone. It's great to be here. So maybe I'm going to start us off, and I'm interested to see kind of where the other panelists take us this evening. But I think I'm going to start off a little bit with kind of a clinical perspective to understand a little bit about what it might be like for a survivor who has experienced trafficking and is using substances. So when I work with a survivor, a lot of what I explain is that the human brain really has built this incredible alarm system. And this alarm system is really crucial to our ability as humans to survive. And so the way the brain operates, right, is when as a human, we're in a situation that's unsafe, that's dangerous, that's abusive, right? The brain automatically sets off that alarm. It releases a surge of chemicals and it prepares our body to go into fight or flight. And we know this from the neuroscience, and we know this from studies, right? This is how the human body responds. For an individual who has experienced chronic danger, right, which is usually the case in a human trafficking case, that alarm system has now had to go off again and again and again and again. And so the brain begins to adapt, and it actually starts to lower that threshold of that alarm system. So I don't know about others here this evening, but I like to say that I lived in an apartment one time that had the world's best alarm system. And so every time I cooked in the kitchen, my fire alarm went off. So it was very effective, right? I was certainly not going to be caught in a fire, but right, we don't actually want an alarm system that has a threshold that low, right? I don't want my alarm system to go off every time I'm cooking in the kitchen. I only want it to go off when there's a fire, right? And that's what happens often for survivors of trafficking, right? That threshold is lower. And so now, even if they have left the trafficking situation, right, that alarm system goes off quite frequently, right? It goes off when a memory pops up, when a smell pops up, when they hear a particular song. And for some survivors who have been in really chronic abusive situations, that alarm system becomes so overwhelmed, it actually shuts off completely and stops going off. And so I think it's important to think about this as we talk about harm reduction, because just like, right, if we were in a room where an alarm system was going off throughout the day, hour after hour after hour, right, that becomes an unbearable way to live life. And so when we're talking about harm reduction and substance use among survivors, right, substances often become their way to regulate that alarm system. Right? It's the way to turn it off when they can't make it stop, right? If it's not going off and they're in a place where they are feeling hopeless and depressed, right? Substances offers a way for them to get up in the morning and get through the day and to survive. And so I think, thinking about that as we talk today about the importance of harm reduction strategies, right? We know why substances actually provide relief and survival skills to survivors, right? Why they help in the moment to get through the day. And I know we'll hear lots of examples of that this evening. So really being able to, when we think about harm reduction, we're not just looking at, what are consequences of substance use and risks involved in substance use, but also what are the ways that substances is actually helping that person survive day to day. And when we can understand that full picture of the use of substances, that's when we have opportunities to engage in interventions and look for other options over time that can replace substances while still getting their daily needs met.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Abigail?
Sure. So the question is just, could you repeat the question?
Oh, just like what is your experience with this intersection of human trafficking and reduction strategy?
So our project works with women, cisgender women who are they remain in active addiction as well as ongoing situations of exploitation and trafficking. For that population, there is no way to possibly engage, build relationship, let alone intervene without a harm reduction framework. Many healthcare professionals, not only those who work specifically with a population that's active like that, healthcare, law enforcement, most systems intersect with survivors when they may not necessarily be ready to change their substance use and or do anything about the relationship they're in, as dangerous or as problematic as it is. And as such, it's unrealistic to expect abstinence or exiting. And a lot of our services are tilted towards individuals who are not using substances and who are ready to exit. And a lot of the women that we work alongside have been told that they can't be helped by a lot of organizations because they're not ready. There's a tremendous amount of space and growth that has to happen before someone is quote unquote ready to make those changes, if ever they can. And again, harm reduction provides a very robust toolkit to work alongside those women. I think there's also a lot of misperceptions about harm reduction, which I'm sure we'll explore. But for me, it is the most critical component in our arsenal when we're working with individuals who, again, this isn't in the past, this is ongoing.
Thank you very much. Ashley, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I was actually going to say something very similar to Abigail, so I appreciate you saying that. And, just from a personal experience, where I saw the intersection of harm reduction was often in outreach. And so a lot of outreach was the only time that I was treated like a human, that I had value, that what I was doing was okay. And, and there was always kind of this premise that on the other side would be something better, right? But then to get to that better side or that other side, there was very large barriers of exiting, the industry and completely like being abstinent from all substances. And so that was where the harm reduction intersection ended for me. And it never made sense. And as a person who's navigating this, you feel like there's a bait and switch happening. Like, why are you coming to me to offer this assistance? And then, oh, here's a caveat. Actually, you need to do this. And then it feels very much like there's so much work that I have to do, that what are you even doing here? And so it felt very limiting, and it was very, even in the aftercare without those harm reduction practices, the whole fault of my success is on me. I don't want it bad enough. I'm not trying hard enough. I just have to adhere to these principles. They're so simple. I just have to follow the rules, and then this better is going to come. And so it just felt to me like I saw harm reduction when I was active within industry and in my substance use through outreach. And then in the aftercare, it was just a complete, 360.
That's interesting. Thank you. Gina.
For me, my experience was living in that hell where drugs were forced upon me. So the substance use was something that was not something I wanted. It was something that was forced upon me. And I didn't even realize how much that substance use became an addiction. Although I did welcome it, I welcomed it because I didn't want to survive. I didn't want to feel anything. I didn't want to see anything. And I was forced into a situation where the substance use really although for me, there was a lot of harm surrounding it, and it increased the exploitation upon me. However, in the other hand, when I was able to escape that hell, that substance use continued, and it became a way of my life. It became something that I didn't even see that there was an issue, because it was something that I used as a survival. And so, yeah, that was something that took me a long time. It was a long journey for me, and it didn't matter who told me what they thought they saw or what they thought that I needed to do. It was going upon deaf ears. What I knew that I needed was just the continuing in that path, to continue to harm myself, not realizing that I was, but I was using it to mask the pain that I was in. And so no matter what anyone told me, it was something that I needed to come to terms with myself in order for me to take the next step.
Thank you. Liz.
So I had two thoughts, and that was the intersection of trafficking and harm reductive practices towards substance use in my work has come largely from what has been part of my actual life experience. And that is that I have utilized a program that I felt was the most harm reductive in my own recovery journey, and brought that into the work that I do in the Baltimore jails. And what I've offered is a set of tools that are tangible, that don't focus on any one substance, but rather on the maladaptive behavior that causes one to use a substance or to, do an addictive behavior of some sort. And so in that way, the harm reduction has been by utilizing the time and space on focusing on behaviors, because in doing so and learning how to manage behaviors, you learn how to manage addictions and eventually find yourself coming away from them. And so that's the intersection of it in my work. And then in my own life, there were no harm reductive options that became available to me when I was being exploited. But in the process of exiting exploitation and the life that I had for the next several years after, where I was using substances, it wasn't until I got sober that I realized why I was using them and how they saved me at times and definitely hurt me at other times. And so just in my personal recovery process, I've learned how to be very gentle and very harm reductive towards myself. And how I manage my own recovery. So those were the thoughts I had on that question in particular.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So, I mean, one thing that came out of the discussion so far is that you already start talking about like some harm reduction strategies that either work for you personally or that you have seen in your work to work. But maybe we can focus a little bit more on that. So, which harm reduction strategies do you find to be most promising or most helpful, most supportive to survivors of human trafficking? Is there some specific approaches that you think that you know or have seen already to work and we should maybe focus on or discuss more? Amanda.
I'm actually thinking a little bit, Ashley, you talked about just kind of your own experience and, the difference when people take a harm reduction approach, and how that really, and I apologize, I can't quote you as well as you said it, but right, really then is a way of viewing someone as a whole person and really valuing them and allowing them to make their own choices, versus this model that comes in and says, this is what you have to do. And if you can't do this, right, you're not ready, you don't want it hard enough. That just continues that shame and blaming. And so the first thing that comes to mind for me is really the cornerstone to any effective harm reduction model is really the importance of creating an environment where survivors are seen and heard and valued. And we know that that's not what usually happens, right? That usually individuals and programs and systems, they perpetuate stigma against substance use, and really then leave survivors in a place to just grapple with feelings of shame and not actually providing them with services and supporting them. And so right now we have a situation where they have their own, trauma from the trafficking and from substance use, and now the system is re-traumatizing them and stigmatizing them, rather than acknowledging, right, the pain that they've experienced and the ways in which substances is supporting their daily survival. And so really being able to create an environment of acceptance, right? Recognizing people's humanity and worth, right? Regardless of their experiences or struggles, that really has to be the cornerstone to any effective harm reduction model.
Thank you. Abigail?
Yeah, I think in terms of concrete strategies, a few come to mind. First and foremost, most basically, safer injection supplies, right? The basic bread and butter, what we can borrow from addiction medicine in terms of making sure that people are able to use more safely. And then also, but I think first and foremost, one has to adopt, and I think this is a tool, it's a clinical tool, it's not concrete, but it's a whole mindset and ethos of authentically lacking judgment. Right? Even when someone is continuing to use or not being able to make immediate changes in an exploitative relationship. Without that authentic lack of judgment, I think that that references what was just said about how judged survivors are in all settings, right? Everywhere they're going, in every system they're going into, they're being seen as less than or culpable, etc. And as such, that sort of really consistent, steady lack of judgment, but authentically so, right? It can't just be like, I'm not judging you. And you feel that from people when they are there's indicators, right, of people feeling comfortable. Another thing that our women who are actively being exploited in the sex trade, over time we observe they become more self-protective in terms of sending us the license plates of sex buyers, right? Or locations, getting them invested in, even if they're in situations of potential trauma, reducing, like staying safe in unsafe situations. That's harm reduction, and that's over time, people start to feel like there's something that they have a bit more, I can do something different. Even if I'm still getting harmed, I'm getting harmed less. I can do something different. And people start to imagine different possibilities. So I think there's concrete harm reduction strategies we know from addiction medicine, but I think those philosophical ones are equally important.
Thank you. I just would like a follow-up question here, because you said, like, and you all for sure agree, like, that the creation of this non-judgmental space is such an important basic premise. Have you seen in your practice how this can actually be achieved, or what are sort of the biggest obstacles in achieving that, especially working with so many different systems when survivors, come forward?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. We've very carefully listened to the women we work with over time. And we did sort of, for example, a 10-month pilot project, an overnight drop-in space to perhaps have, for women who are, again, actively being exploited and trafficked, have a space to drop in. Our 10-month pilot period was in a clinic. Guess what? They didn't want to come to a clinic. Their medical needs was not the most pressing. They wanted a place to touch down, a place to have a snack, a place to shower, a place to wash their clothes. And so we pivoted and developed a drop-in space, right? So even though I'm a clinical psychologist, it's not a clinic. It's a place where people can have these sort of neurobiological moments of safety off the street. And so following the women's lead, everything in that space came from our work with women. So when we say non-judgmental, you have to really know the population, and there's no one sex trade, there's no one survivor, they're not a monolith. And I know I have a unique population of people who are really experiencing homelessness in the street-based sex trade, but you have to follow your population, and that takes time and a whole lot of humility.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in and share, Abigail. I just love what you shared, and there's so much truth in that, and it's so real and raw. And I just wanted to say that because a lot of that I could relate to. There's not a one size excuse me, there's not a one size fits all here. And I know for me, I know even with resources, I mean, many times we talk about how much we need more resources, but even with the resources that are out there, I mean, let's be fair, there are resources out there. But for me, when I think back and when I think of my exploitation and how the drugs and the substance use was being forced upon me, it was something that I ended up welcoming. However, at the same time, I still thought that I had control over the situation. I didn't think that this was something that was becoming an addiction. I mean, it's very difficult to self-identify with what's happening. And for me, that was a huge deal. So having the challenge of self-identifying, and then struggling with the fear, and then struggling with the shame and the violence and the torture. There's so many layers to this. And then finally being able to escape that hell, and then going home, and then who is going to believe you? You know, there's so much shame. That safe place, who is going to be that safe person, that safe place that I could pour all of this out to without being judged? That's why I love what you said, Abigail. That judgmental zone is huge, because, you know, I wanted to be believed. I wanted to have and utilize resources, yet I couldn't. I felt crippled. I felt paralyzed because I knew I was going to be judged. I knew I was going to hear, it was your fault. You know, you created this situation. You made it happen. And so, you know, it wasn't until I just continued to spiral downhill, you know, that I was very lucky that I didn't kill anybody, because hurt people hurt people. And if you don't heal what hurt you, you'll bleed on others who didn't cut you. And for me, I was spiraling downhill. And then I was recognizing as I was going down very, very rapidly, it got to a point. And that's when I realized that, you know what, I really was ready for help. But I had to be ready, and I had to say, I want help, you know, and the help was there for me. But I had to remove those barriers, and I had to remove the shame and the fear and get through all those cobwebs, you know, because I continued to hurt myself and I was hurting others around me.
Thank you, Gina. Ashley.
Yeah, Abigail, you had me thinking about like how I could, you know, think of practical ways. And I think the most practical thing that people can do is language, like harm reductive language. And I'll give some examples. So within the medical, like getting medical care, there was a women's facility that was very harm reduction centered. And the language that they used was that they were very supportive. They were there for me. They just wanted to figure out safety measures so that I could navigate things in a safe way, versus when I would go to an emergency room where the language was, she's a drug seeker, you know, she's here wasting our time. She's just an addict, like she's mentally unstable, and saying it within the vicinity, which is also like not a harm reductive practice. Like I'm sitting here and the doctors are like outside my room, like drug seeking. Like it's just like, wow. And you know, it starts with just the language. And that expands into aftercare. When you go into places and they start talking like there's no need for shame here, and you know, but instead of using more positive words like we are here to support you, we're walking in this journey, like it's a process, you know. And even the terminology within substance use of like clean time, I kept hearing that, and I was like, the opposite for me of clean is dirty. And I was like, that my whole existence within that, you know, like my experience within human trafficking and substance use and within the sex industry, it wasn't all dirty to me. Like I use substances because they were life-saving for me, and they're the whole reason I'm here. I owe a lot to that state of mind that they allowed me to be in. And they were just what got me here, and my motivation. So a lot of the language, it didn't feel like it came from a harm reduction lens or a humanizing lens. It was a lot like, you're telling me not to shame myself, but every word you're using to describe my experience is negative and so demonizing. And so, yeah, I think like one of the most practical things that would be helpful is language.
Thank you. Liz.
And just to clarify, we're capping on what we find would be the most helpful harm reductive approach. Okay. In my work, I have found that having things be survivor only spaces has been some of the most healing harm reductive work I've ever done. At the Restoring Ivy Collective, from our CEO to our CFO and everyone in between, they are survivors. And so when we're in groups together, there's no need to explain yourself. There's no need to worry about how people are going to think of you, because we all live with that fear. And so I have found that that has been a huge joy in the work that I've done. And I think that the way that the rest of the anti-trafficking field could adopt that is to create spaces and places where survivors can be together completely alone, so that they're able to have those opportunities to be their most authentic selves. And I think that every organization serving survivors should be doing so.
Yeah. So you all echo like similar thoughts, right? So the safe space, the non-judgmental language, survivor only groups. My question, or my next question would be is like, where do you see the biggest gaps? Especially when we talk about these other systems that intersect with a survivor, whether it is the healthcare system or then especially the justice system. So where do you see those gaps? And do you have any thoughts about like how to maybe get those other areas also to a point where harm reduction strategies can be put in place, to support survivors of trafficking? Amanda, sorry.
Yeah, and I think please, Gina.
Oh,
no,
Gina, go ahead.
you sure?
Sure.
Oh, that's a loaded question, Danielle. I love it. There's
good.
so many areas, because when I look at my own healing journey, it's a journey. And it's not like, oh, I arrived, I went through almost 3 years of putting myself through drugs and alcohol program and rehabs and halfway houses. But it's a journey. And because of all the trauma involved, because of all the harm, because of so much, this is something that I need to continue with. And so I'm very sensitive with organizations and individuals that I surround myself with, both personally and professionally. And it's the more I do this, the more I'm able to distinguish, what does it mean to be survivor informed? What does it mean to be trauma informed? What does it mean to do this work, whether you're doing the work or not? Not everyone is called to do this work. And what I find is that it could be organizations. I love being around organizations. I love working alongside of individuals like you, the Global Center, and other organizations that are so survivor and trauma informed. And for me, that's harm reduction, because you get it. You not only talk about it, but you actually are putting it into action. And you make sure that we're okay and that we're doing okay and that we're working with each other. And you can distinguish those who are not survivor and trauma informed. And that's like a big red flag for me, because there are organizations out there, and there's organizations that are even some that are survivor led, but they are not working the program, or there's organizations that are using survivors. And I talked about this at Montclair last month, where one is unacceptable. Having one survivor at the table is unacceptable, and one is not enough and zero is unacceptable. So one is not enough and zero is unacceptable. So we are not tokens, because that can increase harm. Being tokens, being exploited, because people are re-exploiting or attempt to re-exploit us all the time, whether they're doing it intentionally or not. I don't know, but I could tell when someone is doing that. And so I think it's really important to make sure that the people that we are working alongside of, that they're just not using us as tokens. The worst feeling in the world is sitting at a table with a bunch of people who are survivors. Maybe there's a couple survivors there at the table, and then there's a whole lot of people that are not survivors, and they're talking about us, but it's like we're not even in the room, but we are in the room. That is horrifying. It's just a terrible feeling, and it's very triggering, and it's very upsetting. And I just want people to understand that that causes so much harm, and that if you're not going to do this work right, and I love Senator McKnight said this, if you're not going to do it, if you're not going to have compassion and do it right, then we shouldn't be doing this work. But don't use survivors for anything, both personally or professionally, and talk about them like they're not in the room. And if you look around and there's no survivors in the room, that's another sign that you're not doing it right. So there's a lot of layers to this, and I don't want to take up more time, so my colleagues have a chance to respond too, but I could always swing back.
Definitely, thank you. Abigail, start with you to start.
Gaps. I have a few thoughts about gaps and then potential solutions.
Yeah.
We know that commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking and SUD, substance use disorder, is a highly prevalent intersection, right? And yet there's a shockingly limited number of specialized services, and there's a shockingly limited level of knowledge among addiction experts, right? And there's lots of reasons for that, and that would be a whole other talk. But because of this, there's very significant silos between the substance use disorder field and the human trafficking field. Services for both are really siloed, at least in my community. It's either you can go there to get help for exploitation, you can go there for addiction. And God help you if you're in active addiction and want to access services for exiting or for any form of exploitation and trafficking, because there's so many barriers in terms of abstinence, right? So we need many more low threshold spaces and low threshold relationships. Low threshold meaning locations and relationships that require the least amount of burden on the person who has no trust for the healthcare system, right? That's why we meet with women in the street or in jail, et cetera, like many of my co-panelists do as well. So those low threshold spaces are needed before, again, the big readiness moment happens. Given the levels of severe trauma that predate exploitation and trafficking, there's no reason someone's going to have trust in a relationship or have experience in a relationship. That needs to be developed over time. So there's many gaps, unfortunately, that are built into our very siloed SUD trafficking ecosystems. In terms of solutions, I think one of the most important competency skills, if you're doing clinical work with this population or any work with this population, is to be able to advocate across systems, because we know our systems have varying levels of knowledge about trafficking and exploitation. That's really true in child protection systems. You can imagine all the people you've worked in who've been really, frankly, harmed and abused because the child protection system doesn't understand adult women who have been trafficked, in my experience, not to mention kids. We're not even talking about that. But oftentimes systems need some explanation of the behavior before them. That's ideally trauma-informed advocacy. Two quick examples. A woman that we were working with was going to be sentenced for contempt because she was refusing to talk about an incident that happened in front of her, and her life had been threatened and involved trafficking. Trafficking was not mentioned at all in the formal record, but that's what was happening. So to have her team be able to be in the courtroom a peer and a psychologist, that's the way we work, that's the model we have, to be able to say that she has a good reason to fear, to use our privilege in that moment mattered, right? It mattered. A second example, another woman who was supposed to show up to court. Going to court is so difficult for our population, right? They are so judged, they're afraid to get locked up. And this happened last night. We saw her last night. Her plan was to go meet this man who we knew had a history of trafficking, but she had a plan for the night to make some money. And then she was going to go to court in the morning and he was going to drive her. That didn't end up happening. And she called when, you know, he was screaming at her, and we Ubered her to court. And our message to her was consistently, just get to court, just get to court. Doesn't matter if you're high, doesn't matter if you're not dressed, if you didn't have your face on, just get there, because that's going to keep you out of that system, right? She did get to court, and at court, the lawyer was so extraordinarily judgmental. The judge said that our patient said, Judge, I've made a lot of changes in the last week. I'm on Sublocade. I haven't done dope. I have, I have smoked crack, but I'm trying to do harm reduction. Her words. And the judge said, I'm not a fan of harm reduction. And my heart kind of stopped, because if we have systems where a person on the bench is saying that to a woman who's trying to do the best she can, who ran a gauntlet to get to the courthouse, and then when she's there, she's told she's not doing good enough because she's not clean. And she's also, and I think the presence of us in the courtroom helped her then share more about what happened. And she shouldn't have to say, I ran from this guy this morning. I ran out of the house in my sports bra. She shouldn't have to say that. But if our systems had more of an understanding about what this looks like on an ongoing basis, the criminal justice system could be less punishing. So I apologize for the digression, but I think that role of advocacy is really important.
Yeah, not really a digression. I think that is a really important aspect to consider as well. Absolutely. Liz, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so the gaps that I'm thinking are mainly with funders. We're having organizations implementing programming that is harm reductive in practice, and we're having funders go, no, you have to serve this population with this type of approach, so on and so forth. And so we're getting this funding, and then we have to design our programming around a certain goal, and it leaves no room for true harm reductive programming to make available to people. And then the other gap that I wanted to really bring up is the lack of services and attention put on survivors over a certain age who have maybe been in the sex trade for a very long time. There's no 401k, there's no social security waiting for them, and there's no housing. And so if I could adopt and implement any other thing to fill a gap, it would be for that specific population, because unfortunately our survivor pioneers are dying and there's nothing we can do to help.
That's actually something that I came across a lot in the literature, is like this need for housing, that is really an immediate need. Thank you. Amanda.
Yeah, I would say there's so many good things that have been said here in terms of, right, just how ill-equipped our systems are. Ill-equipped is probably the nicest way of saying it, right? How often judgmental and how much harm they create. Gina, I was thinking a lot. I really appreciated what you said. And, part of what I was reflecting on as a provider, right, is I think as a provider, it's really easy for me to sit here and be like, oh, all of those other systems create harm. And yet what we also know to be true is that some of the people, right, and organizations that are really well-intended also create a lot of harm for survivors. And it's been said, right, this is not a monolithic group, and we are nowhere near knowing everything we could possibly know. And so anyone who's in this field needs to be, Abigail, you mentioned, right, needs to be humble, needs to be constantly learning and challenging themselves. And we really need this movement to be, right, led and driven by survivors, because they are the experts. And right, engaging with survivors, as you said, Gina, right, not in an exploitive fashion, not because, oh, they have stories they can tell, but because they're actually the leading experts on how these programs and systems should be developed and implemented. And so without that leadership, right, we won't have effective programs. And so really using that as the model for the field.
Ashley. Gina, did you want to follow up?
No, I was just going to say thank you for sharing that, because we need you. We need all of you very much, but nothing about us without us. And we need each other, and collaboration is important. And being in that non-safe, just feeling safe. People need to feel safe. And as Abigail said, be kind, be compassionate, and a judge-free zone. You know, it just takes a lot of things that we can think are complicated or we may take for granted, but they're pretty simple when you think about it. Just to be kind human beings, because when you think how our humanity was robbed from us, we can all make a difference. And I can't say enough about, even with people like yourself, Danielle, and Ali and Christabella, and there's so many, and HEAL, so many organizations out there that are really doing the work and doing it right to reduce this harm reduction and providing the resources and making us and many people feel so safe. But we all have a responsibility here.
Ashley.
Thank you so much. I feel like one of the biggest gaps that I see within that is that, especially in the substance use space, like not only is it very siloed from human trafficking, but it's also been relatively unchanged. I mean, I have a family history of substance use recovery, and I remember a lot of the methods. And then when I went to go get recovery, I ended up in the same place. And then 10 years down the line, when I was still looking for some type of recovery, it was like the same recommendation. And I was like, this is like Groundhog Day. And it doesn't make any sense, because substances have evolved, use has evolved, our understanding of trauma and its intersections have evolved. And yet I'm still being recommended the same thing. And I'm looking and I'm like, it hasn't worked. The last 7 times I've tried it, I don't really understand why I keep going to the same place. And I fear that in human trafficking, that can happen as well, where a lot of these organizations get a program or curriculum and it works, and then they just stick with it for years without changing it, even though our understanding of how sex trafficking and labor trafficking works and the nuances should allow for changes within the program. And so I just feel like the biggest gap is just, we have to change with the times. And a lot of that will come from having survivor influence, so we can really say like what has been working and what hasn't. Because what I see is that us survivors are healing. And then a lot of these organizations are almost taking credit for it, when I'm like, I actually didn't get healing from you. I may have gone through your program, but I healed beyond it, you know, for myself. And so like, how can we combine what I did with your program and like bring it up to date?
Thank you. Yeah, so you were just saying it, but it also like echoed with me, like this idea of that, you know, programs are being developed left and right, but the survivor input just really is not there at the level that we would like to see it. And that is certainly something that organizations and agencies across all systems probably you know, should think about first to really create programs that are helpful. We have about 10 minutes left, so because I do want to keep some time for questions and answers from the audience. Maybe as we have a very diverse list of participants, but what is something you would like the people to really take away from this discussion? Like what is something that's really important to you, to the work you do, the things you would like to see change or turn for the better? Just some very personal sort of insights. Amanda, sorry.
You know, so I'm still reflecting a little bit, I think, on that, like what are things that work in harm reduction? And so speaking maybe to people who work in the field or who are interested in working in the field, you know, I think the number one thing to keep asking ourselves are, you know, are we listening to survivors? So if there's a survivor I'm working one-on-one with, right? Even when we're thinking about what are risks and what are harms and what are their needs, right? I don't know that. I'm not living their life. I'm not experiencing their day-to-day. And so letting them lead that, right? What what are they most worried about, right? Maybe I'm most worried about substances, right? Maybe they're most worried about having a safe place to sleep and a meal. And so, right, I can't be effective at all as a service provider if it's not starting with really understanding, right, this person in front of me, what do they need from their perspective, and letting that be, right, kind of the foundation which we build everything off of.
Thank you. Gina.
Oh, I would say stop looking for our stories. Stop looking at us like we are just survivors. We are more than our stories. We are human beings. What happened to us was a huge violation. Our humanity was robbed. We were robbed. And I know for me, I mean, I'm reminded every day of my story. It's just some memories cannot be erased, no matter how much you stay on that path of your healing journey. But I don't like when people look at you that you are a survivor. We have our personal life, we have our professional life, and we do have our lived experience. But I would just say that when we're doing this work, just ensure that there are lived experts at your table, because as I said earlier, there can't be anything about us without us. And for anyone out there trying to exploit survivors for your fundraisers, for your sensationalism, for whatever that might look like, for your research, and then you turn around and want to hand survivors and offer them $25 gift card, or some of you feel that lived experts shouldn't even be compensated, you're causing a lot of harm. Because if you have an electrician coming into your house, rewiring your house, he's not going to, or she's not going to do it for nothing. Everyone deserves to be compensated and respected and treated with respect and dignity. So I just wanted to say that that's really important. We are more than what happened to us. No one asked for this. No one dreams of it as a child and says, I want to be raped. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Abigail?
I guess I'm going to be a little bit repetitive, but I think the importance, particularly when we're talking about co-occurring substance use disorder, of being responsive to that large subpopulation of people for whom exploitation and addiction is ongoing, and they're not ready to engage with services that exist. There is so much more we need to do to develop more responsive, like, opportunities for them. I would also add, to underscore, because we're in such a specialized space around, as someone said, addiction medicine is very different, right? There's medication for opioid use disorder. There's injectable, there's a lot of things. And when you have survivor-led and survivor-informed groups, to make sure that peers who are leading the way, like those on the panel, are able to embrace and espouse multiple pathways to recovery. Because I think where sometimes survivor-led services go astray is when it's my way or no way. And that I've seen that a lot, that this is the only way that you can get better. And that's really dangerous in the substance use disorder space, because a life-saving medication might be considered by someone else to be not really recovery, right? Like changing one medication for another. So I believe very strongly in not only nothing without us, without the slogan, nothing about us, in collaboration, trusted clinicians, especially with SUD, because this is, I mean, we're in an opioid crisis, right? You all know individuals who have died, and we have to partner with the best practices as well as the lived experience. I really believe strongly in that. So thank you for letting me be able to say that.
Thank you. Liz.
I think I'll end it on a personal note. I hope that if any survivor is watching or watches in the future, to go off of something Abigail said about life-saving medication, I had to go through a huge grieving process when I got sober over the idea that I would be medicated forever and ever, and that did not take away the validity of my sobriety. And so as someone who uses multiple medications daily to maintain my life, as well as cannabis, I'm still a huge proponent of sobriety and recovery. I just believe that that can look very different for anybody, and that if you think that you're not doing it right, that's not true. You can do it any way it takes to keep you alive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Ashley.
Yeah, I love what everyone has said, and I just appreciate this space so much. I just really want to say that. And for me, I think the biggest takeaway is that not everything that you see is going to be sex trafficking or substance use disorder. We are actually a very small portion of the population. We are very nuanced. And so it's just a note to all of you that everywhere you look, your awareness doesn't mean that you're seeing sex trafficking or rampant substance use disorder. And for substance use specifically, not all substance use is problematic. And people may have a problematic moment, but that doesn't mean that they have a problematic issue with substances for life. For all substances, there are substances out there that do have a beneficial use. And that was kind of touched on by Abigail and Liz. And so I just think like reframing just how we see and really understanding the spectrum of substance use and sex trafficking will just help everyone to kind of release that judgment that everything that they're seeing is the big one, the big sex trafficking substance use disorder.
Definitely. That's a very important point. Thank you. Do any of you have any follow-up comments to what your colleagues have said before we go into the Q&A section?
I want to make a comment, Danielle. I really want to encourage healthcare, anyone working in healthcare, to look at other ways. And I hear it more and more. They're circling around this rabbit hole of how to identify a victim of trafficking. They keep wanting to find out, how do I identify a victim? How do I identify a victim? We're not check boxes. If a victim is unable to identify that they're a victim, it's not going to matter if you identify who's a victim or not. But there's other ways of doing it. There's a way of giving them another blanket. Maybe they need a sandwich. They may be hungry. They may be tired. Instead of asking them 50 questions to fill that form out, they may need to rest for 20 minutes or a half hour. They may be cold. They're afraid. So if you could just be that safe person and be compassionate and be kind and not have to spin your wheels around to try to figure out who's a victim or not. Because many times, even if you can identify that I'm a victim, it doesn't mean that I'm going to acknowledge that I'm a victim. So I just wanted to share that.
Gina, I so appreciate that. I think one of my irritants is still this over focus on identification, which has dominated like the first 20 years of healthcare research. It's like, can we just agree that people disclose when they're ready and when they feel safe? When they feel safe, and it's not ours to identify. That's so paternalistic. So I really, really appreciate what you said. And I think that part of the artifact of this field, growing up from a law enforcement framework, right? And so really move away from that. And some of my greatest colleagues are law enforcement, but to focus on the relationship, always the relationship. So thank you.
And Abigail, I remember being in the ER one time and I was like beaten to the pulp, and the ER staff was asking me, who did this? How did this happen? And they knew I was beaten up. And I said, I fell because I believed it was my fault. And plus I was scared. I was scared of more retaliation. So it doesn't matter what that healthcare person is trying to find out. Even if I know, I may not admit. So.
Thank you. Anybody else? No, we're good. All right. So for the participants online, if you have any questions, please just drop them in the Q&A box. I have one question here right now. it kind of relates to what was that just came up in the discussion a little bit, just in the different system. The biggest challenge in my work has been getting those in law enforcement to understand the importance of survivor-informed practice and failing to take accountability for the ways that they have caused harm to survivors historically. Is there hope that we can change their perspective? What are the implications if we cannot?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, sure. Anybody.
I mean, I work very closely with law enforcement, and it happened out of necessity because so many of my patients often had needs for someone trusted in law enforcement. So during COVID, I reached out to the commander of the human trafficking unit in the Boston Police Department for a resource for my patient. And I asked offhand, could I ever come ride along with you all, see what happens, right? Fully expecting he'd be like, no, like, see you never, like, who are you? Like, I've never met you. But he said yes. And I have been doing that ever since 2020. And what evolved as first observational has become, rather than using arrest, which this unit doesn't use, having an immediate introduction to either my peer colleague or myself in that moment, not with the expectation that they're going to leave or stop using, but because those interactions, those individuals, that creates a relationship. And I've been really deeply surprised and heartened by, again, it's all relationship building. If you can find one trusted law enforcement and a whole bunch of bad actors, this is how cultural change happens. Now, when we do joint trainings together, my peer colleague, me, and the sergeant detective, he'll say things coming out of his mouth that, like, we taught him, like, you know, don't build the case, like, you have to have a relationship with the person. I'm like, what? This is like a Boston dude, right? And he's like, no, you can't push. You have to wait until, like, you know, 12 months, 16 months, then they call. And likewise for me, like, that cross-pollination that comes with trusted relationships, I do feel hopeful about that. But I think we have to reach across the aisle. I came up early in this work inheriting this knowledge and knowing from women how harmful law enforcement could be. But if you don't reach across the aisle and try to build a collaboration, we exist in these silos, and we have a police state, right? We can't get rid of that. So how do we make it effective and more trauma informed? So I actually feel quite hopeful, but it requires bravery. And again, that humility of, like, we have different roles here. So I have a lot of hope, actually.
You know, as a survivor of sex trafficking, I remember I was happy one day to get arrested. I really was. I was tired. I was in so much pain. I said, I'm going to get help, not knowing that when I was arrested, and I gave them my real name, not the name that the traffickers gave me. I told them, that's not my name. This is my real name. Long story short, I was violated by an officer. I was raped, and then I was released back to my traffickers. So today, I have to say, before my healing journey started, I had nothing but despise toward law enforcement. But I could actually say today, because there's evil, there's good and bad, and all different. It doesn't matter what you are, if you're a healthcare worker, if you're a law enforcer, if you're a teacher or pastor, it could happen anywhere to anybody. But I have to say that the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and I see it a lot with the Global Center too, and many other good organizations such as yourself, Abigail, and there's a lot of training going on. We're training a lot more law enforcement, and they do want to learn. I'm working with a lot of them, and they want to understand, and they do care. And the ones that I'm working with, they're like open to continuing to learn. And they don't want to come in as looking at the victim anymore, like the victim is the one that's going to be arrested now. And so I really love, through my lens, what I'm seeing. I love what I'm seeing when it comes to law enforcement. So I see the change already happening. We have a lot more work to do, but it's starting.
Always.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to chime in, or? Yes, Ashley.
Yeah, when I was going through my degree, that's where I really realized where the issue is starting with law enforcement. And that's in, like, the rules that govern them. Because what I learned to realize was law enforcement, government, all that, like, they have rules that they have to abide by. And although they have, like, the power of discretion, there's a guidebook, and there are rules and there are laws that they have to follow. And so for me, changing in a harm reduction thing is like, we need to change the rules. We need to change these laws and really come up with ways in which there is no excuse, there is no discretion that they have to, follow. Like this is how the protocol will go moving forward. And so I do a lot of like criminal justice reform with the original statutes and laws within our state to really figure out, like, if I can't change your opinion, then I'm going to change what you follow, because that's how we're going to affect change within this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have another question here. Can you speak to how harm reduction can be applied with children, youth under 18 years of age who are being sex trafficked and using substances? Any unique considerations related to the developmental vulnerabilities and protection needs? Anyone want to jump in?
It's such a great question. I actually want to hear my panelists, because I started in this work with juveniles and I don't work with the kids anymore. But one of the most challenging things is like, there's such an impetus to protect because they're minors, right? That's why we have a robust child protection response to imperfect. So I think I'd like to hear my panelists. Yeah.
That's a hard one. I think that, like Abigail's saying, we have a propensity to protect. And one of the things that approach does is that it takes these people back to being helpless children, when we approach it from the protection aspect. And so when we recognize that the youth that are being trafficked, that are using substances, they're not with their peers developmentally anymore. They are small adults who have not earned the legal right to be an adult yet. And so when we acknowledge that and treat them with the same respect and dignity that we would any colleague, we're going to find a very different outcome of behaviors and continued addictions when people are given that kind of space, especially youth, especially because they've had so much taken from them already.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, Gina.
Go ahead, Ashley. No, go ahead.
I was going to say another thing that's really been helpful. Some of the youth outreach was the most harm, like had the most harm reduction approach. And that was really, really helpful because the reality is like, they're doing drugs, and just because you make it illegal, we're kids. We don't really have all the brain function to really process that through. And I started using substances because they were fun, like I wanted to have fun with my friends. I wanted to feel something else. And that was just a reality. Like they weren't this bad thing to me. And I was being told, like, if you use drugs, you're going to be an addict. I was not. I was a straight A student. I was doing things. I was, like they weren't problematic until they were problematic for me. But instead of demonizing them, like just helping me to like know where I could go to get harm reduction when it became problematic would have been useful, because I had that idea that I was doing something so bad I had nowhere to go and no one to be honest with. And that would have been the best. And that would really have helped a lot of my friends who were overdosing, or people who were the problematic use became so bad that it was harmful to us, but we just really didn't know where to go because the only answer was just don't do it. And so really for kids and teens is like teaching them how to have, safe drug practices, even for their friends. I teach my daughter how to use Narcan. She doesn't use, but I'm like, you never know who around you might. And if you ever do, I want it on your person. I really want to make those allowances for mistakes because you're a kid, and things happen and kids are using.
Yeah, I wanted, Ashley pretty much said a lot of what I was going to say, but what I do want to add on to that is that communication and education is the key. And just being able to, like, Ashley, what you did with your daughter, like trying to like teach her, and like, even if she may not need it, even if her friends may not need it, at least you're teaching her. And by you teaching her, you're providing awareness, and awareness is going to be prevention. So I feel that to the core of everything we talk about education, because education is going to bring awareness, and awareness is going to be prevention. And just being able, I teach so many students from middle school through universities, and they're probably the most most engaging, because they have so much that they want to share, so much that they want to talk about, but they also want to make sure that whoever they're going to talk to, they're going to feel safe, that they could trust that person. And so if we could be a safe person to people, we may not see the results immediately, but they're going to remember that you're a safe person.
Mhm. Thank you. Another question came up. Any advice on how human trafficking task forces can vet substance use programs for partnership and referrals?
Can vet?
Mhm.
That's a great question. I think, and this goes back to what Ashley was saying about how there's a lot of archaic knowledge that gets inherited. There's also a lot of good knowledge. I think if you can connect with trusted providers who are addiction medicine physicians, addiction psychiatrists, LADACs, people who are in the field who know the current science, right? Who can bring to the table ideas that are actually evidence-based, as opposed to, this is how I did it, so this is how you do it. That's not helpful, right? And just the multiplicity of possible ways to recover, right? For some people, they will never go to AA or NA. For some people, they need to be on medication for opioid use disorder forever. There's so much variability. But there are really good folks out there doing very exciting work. And I think if you, I'm happy to give names of people across the country, like, who are doing good work, and who have like a vested interest in this. To be honest, I think I've learned so much about harm reduction from the addiction space. I didn't get that in grad school. I didn't get it from anyone in the trafficking world until all of a sudden I had this huge amount of patients who had ongoing addiction too. So there's a vibrant addiction field that we have to partner with.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's also a lot of scams, right? There's so much, and I know that's what the question is. So that's why, go to the professional organizations, peer-reviewed research. It's not perfect, but it's not like Joe's rehab, right? Where it's like he put out a shingle, or Joanne's rehab, whatever.
Amanda, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to add, it's another great place to pull in like survivor expertise, like the local organizations that work with survivors, right? What are they hearing in terms of what programs their survivors feel safe in? Paying an advisory group of survivors to make those recommendations. I've worked in programs before where even when we've hired staff, we pay survivors to be a part of that interview panel so that they're providing feedback. That's a great opportunity for partnership with survivors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is one more question related to Ashley Maha's comments about language. I noticed that the term substance abuse was included in the title of this panel. This term has been criticized among harm reductionists as being stigmatizing. Do folks on this panel have thoughts on this?
Right. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, just what I had said before about things progressing that is also kind of new, of just like really understanding how language affects the psyche of survivors and victims, because we're actually feeling comfortable enough to voice like that really bothered me when you keep saying I was abusing drugs, because there were times when, like, for me, like, drugs saved my life, you know what I mean? And having that relationship is okay. It doesn't mean I'm going to go back, but like, I am okay with that relationship and understanding my use in that way. And you keep saying abuse doesn't connect with how I felt about my past. And so I just feel like the language is changing, and we can only do so much, and tomorrow something else is going to be different. And so I feel like just us having this whole conversation is really harm reduction. But I do understand that, like, there are certainly spaces where abuse, I don't like to use abuse. I actually changed it in my own bio. But that was just like, because I'm following the trends and going with what, is coming out.
Mm-hmm.
But that's exactly
as a follow-up. Is there a term that you actually do prefer, like that you
yeah, so
use in your own...
talk about substance use on like a continuum from like
Mhm.
no use at all. And, you know, and I actually, someone mentioned Canada. I actually had looked at some harm reduction things out of Canada and looked at their spectrum and like adopted what felt good to like only my experience and what I've seen. And that, you know, like no use, beneficial use, problematic use, and then wanted to include substance use disorder just because that is something that people will hear. And you know, and so that's kind of like the spectrum of use. And there's no, you know, even the problematic use, that's problematic to you. That's not problematic to me. Like if you are considering your use to be in a problematic angle, then that is your choice. And so that was just like there's use, and then I don't assign, you know, morality or anything to it or how I view. It's your view of your use.
Thank you, Abigail. Sorry, I jumped
No,
over
no,
you.
no, no, no. I think you're at the person who asked the question is totally spot on. Even the Journal of Substance Abuse renamed itself and issued like language guidelines. So it does matter. I think there's also a difference sometimes between outward facing use of language, like presentations like this, it should have said substance use, in my opinion, right? And then also the language we use with patients or mentees or whomever, because like technically the clean and dirty tropes, that's a no-no according to many people, right? But the women I work with, they say clean. So I'm going to say clean. I'm going to defer to the language they use. They get to decide what language they use, not the stupid Journal of Substance Use, right? No offense. Now I'll never publish there, right? But no, but so there's a difference between outward facing and language. And a resource for those of you who are interested in this, there's a great online resource called the Addictionary, very clever name, at my home institution, MGH. John Kelly developed it. So if you're ever curious about language and why a term might be problematic, the Addictionary is a cool resource and it's forever updated. It doesn't mean it's the be all end all source, but it's really useful. So thank you for the question.
I also did not like the clean dirty thing and decided to avoid it when I got sober. But I've since like processed through a lot of that, and I get why people use it. And I think that comes down to much like here, like in this moment, as we are here as survivors or lived experts, like we choose what we call ourselves and we choose what we call our things. And for me, I never label myself as an alcoholic. I just say I'm an addict. And I only say I'm an addict when I'm talking about it, but I wouldn't like, I'm an Aquarius, I'm an addict, I'm a, you know, like I'm not gonna throw all of that out at one time. So I think that it's just one of those things where people are gonna learn what works for them. And like Ashley said, you go with the trend, you update it as you go. If somebody says clean in terms of their own use, I'll just use a different word to relate mine, but I'm not going to tell them, ew, don't use that. You know, that's their journey. So I think we'll just see as more time goes on and how it evolves, what we end up using as a substance use disorder.
Liz, I'm curious too, and you're welcome to pass on this, but I'm curious, is that similar to kind of language around like exploitation, human trafficking, right? Kind of all the different words that are used in that space too.
Yeah, I think that people get comfortable with what they're okay with, and other people are like, oh no, that evokes this huge reaction in me. I'm not okay with that. And I think what we just have to come to understand is that that's a personal choice that doesn't affect us. But we have to honor that that person, you know, don't use that language with that person, and don't maybe not use it anymore going forward. But I think that's a process that is as individual to people as their spiritual beliefs. And so whatever their words are, that is deeply ingrained in who they are. And it's hard to look at someone and say that's wrong, you shouldn't use that language, when it's so so yeah.
Thank you. I don't have direct questions anymore. I think the participants can see the Q&As. There's an interesting post by a colleague from Canada. They worked on drug and sex policy work, and that are all harm reduction based. So there's even an email contact. So thank you very much for sharing that and making that available. And then there were 2 other comments more, but not necessarily questions. So I think if there's no more questions from the participants, I think we can wrap this up. It was a great panel. So much to learn also in the language area. Like I never stop learning. Every time I talk to somebody, I read something, there's always new ways of looking at things. And so I'm really appreciative of having had the opportunity to bring you all together. And thank you very much for your time. I don't know if you want to like have some final words that you want to share with the audience before you leave. Let's see.
Thank you all for coming. And for my co-panelists who I haven't met, it's so great to meet you all. Let's stay in touch. And thank you for the organization. This is such a rarely explored topic, at least in my world. So thank you.
And thank you also again to Dr. Williams and his you know, leadership in giving us the opportunity to bring this panel together. Okay, well then I will stop recording. And thank you all for coming and joining us today.